Welcome to Chrononauts Episode 2, Mary Shelley. We're going to talk about 3 works. The first one is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, published in 1818 and then republished in 1831. This is a very significant science fiction novel because it's considered oftentimes the first sci-fi novel. Second, we're going to be talking about Mary Shelley's The Last Man, published in 1826. And this was a suppressed text that was then re-released in 1960 and is oftentimes considered one of the first apocalyptic novels. And it really depicts the future, a pretty bleak future. And the third thing that we're going to be talking about tonight is Presumption, or the Fate of Frankenstein, which was written in 1823 by Richard Brinsley Peake. And it was a play that Mary Shelley herself was able to see in her lifetime. So with that, let's get into Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. First off, Nate, do you want to give us a little bit of context for that?
Sure. So this was famously written between a writing contest between Mary Shelley, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and I think somebody else was there.
William Polidori.
Yeah. So they
John
were,
Polidori.
I think, hanging out in a cabin in Germany, and they had all these German ghost stories, and they got inspired to write their own. And the contest was who would write the scariest story. And Mary had a hard time at first getting it going, but she was so struck by a dream she had of a reanimated creature. And what really horrified her was the idea that science is progressing to the point where man may be able to create life, thus mocking God, the creator. And anything that would be created in such a way would be an abomination of nature. And this kind of stuck with her, and she couldn't shake it, and she just had to write it down. So that was the birth of Frankenstein, and it obviously won the competition of the scariest story between them. I kind of like to read the losing entries, but
because Polidori was the only other one that actually finished the story. The others never. Lord Byron had one. It's published in an excerpt because he only wrote a little bit of it. Apparently, it was also a kind of a vampire tale. And Polidori, who was Lord Byron's personal physician, actually did write a story called The Vampire, in which the vampire himself, I can't recall his name, but he is actually a caricature of Lord Byron. Apparently, none of the others actually liked Polidori very much.
To add a little bit more context, from what I've read, Mary Shelley was traveling a lot during this time, and one of the places she traveled to or near was actually called the Frankenstein Castle. And so that's where that name derives from, is from this castle that was nearby on their travels through, I can't remember where they went exactly, but on their way to their cold summer, the winter summer. It was a very...
The summer, the year without the summer.
The year without the summer, because they were in a volcanic summer, basically, because the sun had been blocked out by a recent volcanic eruption.
Yeah. So this was actually a volcanic eruption. Sorry. This was actually the eruption of... let's see, I have this in my notes here. It was a volcano in Malaysia. And... apparently, this was such a significant volcanic eruption that basically the entire world, the sky was like covered in ash, and that's why they call that the year without the summer.
And I think this is going to be a reoccurring theme because we will see this again in our second piece. I think a little bit. Mount
Tambora. That's the name of the volcano.
Yeah.
Comets and volcanoes play a large part in the mysticism and superstition of the age.
Let's see if there's just some things that I can add about the versions of Frankenstein at this point. So there are actually three revisions, but the 2 major revisions are the original of 1818, which was published anonymously. And, but by the way, it didn't take people very long to actually attribute Mary's name to it. The other version was, I think actually one of the reasons why it wasn't that difficult was because she dedicated it to her father, William Godwin. I don't know a lot about William Godwin, except he was apparently an advocate of free love, and his wife was a feminist.
Godwin was an anarchist. I'm not exactly sure what 18th century anarchism looks like. But Percy Shelley was one of his disciples or students, and he ran off with Mary. And from what I understand, Godwin was pretty pissed about that. But Godwin wrote a number of political novels, which all sound really boring. His wife, on the other hand, Mary Wollstonecraft, was a prominent early feminist who wrote a couple Gothic novels with feminist overtones that it might be interesting to take a look at sometime further down the line.
Until recently, the 1831 version of Frankenstein was the more publicly known version and the more studied version. But in the last few decades, from what I've been reading, and this has actually been my little pet project recently, because I didn't realize there was such a controversy around the editions of Frankenstein and the revisions that were done to it in 1831. Now, I read Frankenstein twice before this session that we're doing now, and these were both in my early 20s, so it has been a while. I don't exactly know which versions I read at the time. I've always had a little bit of a problem in studying stuff in that I tend to rely rather heavily on e-texts since around the year 1999. So basically, sometimes I'm not quite aware of what version I'm reading because they don't always record or annotate that stuff as well as they should. Mind you, not that print editions are free of that. Nate and I were talking about old editions of things that he has, compilations from the 20s and 30s, I think, done by some guy in New York, and they never credit the translator. They're all nastily put together with smudges and misprints and everything like that.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll get around to our good friend Walter at some point.
Yeah, so anyway, I have not always been aware of that. This session for this thing that we're doing, I actually listened to the audio book available from Audible with Simon Vance reading, and the text appears to be, I don't know, it appears to be an aggregate of both versions, and I'm not quite sure what they were doing, because there are some things that don't quite add up, but it looks mostly like the 1831 version. Anyway, there is an essay that I found that was written by a teacher named Anne Melchior, I believe. And she says, I'll just briefly quote this. She says, Anne K. Mellor, that's her name. She says, "Which edition of Frankenstein should I teach? This question is more complicated than it might at first appear. There are critical significant differences among the manuscripts of Frankenstein in the Bodleian Library. The first edition of the novel in 1818 and the second and heavily revised edition of 1831. Since current text editing theory and practice no longer assume that the author's final word is definitive, we cannot select the final edition for that reason alone, nor should we be unduly swayed by the fact that the 1831 edition in the Signet Nail National Library costs less than $2. She also says, "I strongly believe that the text of preference should be the 1818 edition, for the same reason that students of Romanticism prefer the 1805 edition of Wordsworth's Prelude to the final 1850 edition. The first completed versions of both works have greater internal philosophical coherence, are closest to the author's original conceptions, and are more convincingly related to their historical contexts. In Frankenstein, these contexts are biographical. The recent death of Mary Shelley's first baby, and her dissatisfactions with Percy Shelley's romantic ideology. More on that later. Political, her observations of the aftermath of the French Revolution in 1814-16. And scientific, the experiments with galvanic electricity in the first decade of the 19th century. And I'll briefly finish off by saying the most striking thematic differences between the two published versions of the novel concern the role of fate, the degree of Frankenstein's responsibility for his actions, the representation of nature, the role of Clairvaux, and the representation of the family, by which she means Victor's family. And she goes on, but in essence, I think that Mary's experiences with life and also perhaps editorial things done by her husband, Percy, had a lot of influence on the later version. And Percy was more atheistic. He kind of sort of put aside a little bit of Victor's responsibility for the things that happened. So anyway, I'm sure that everybody really knows the story. I don't think we really have to summarize it, do we?
I was just going to say that's a really good point. Let's start talking about why this is considered one of the first science fiction novels. Why did we choose this one to start our sci-fi through literature journey? Because we looked at proto-sci-fi before, and now we're going to start looking at science fiction as a pre-genre. This is before it is considered a genre, and the term hadn't even been coined yet. But why is it so important? What are those earmarks of this novel that do make it, or make us consider it, one of the first sci-fi novels? And I think we've got framing devices, scientists, we've got some different ideas of prophecy, self-fulfilling and self-preventing prophecy, which we end up seeing in sci-fi, and also the existential choice, which is something that becomes very key to science fiction as it starts to evolve. So let's start talking about that. Why is this, to us, one of the first sci-fi novels?
I have a thought about this, and it concerns the general themes of Frankenstein. Nate did actually slightly summarize the premise of Frankenstein earlier on, and while I don't disagree with what he said, I actually think the hubris and the scientific hubris angle of Frankenstein the novel has been slightly exaggerated. I think that this novel is really about responsibility. I think that Frankenstein is basically the ultimate deadbeat dad. This is basically a story about somebody who gets really excited because they can do something awesomely cool and then just forgets about it and tries to go about his normal life, and he does not take the responsibility. There's no reason why a man shouldn't be able to create a child without a woman, which is another sci-fi concept, actually.
Yeah, and that definitely ties into the feminist themes of the novel, is that Frankenstein is an absentee father and there's not a female figure around, so the monster turns out to be a monster without the proper guidance.
That's where I think that those themes, the hubris, the monster, and the choice making start to come in to making that the genre making gel that turns this into a different type of novel than we've seen before.
Yeah, and especially compared to the stuff that we talked about last time.
Oh, it's a huge contrast.
Last time, all the stuff we talked about was using Fantastic Voyages as a vehicle for satire, as a vehicle for humor, as a vehicle for philosophical ideas. This isn't really any of those. I mean, there are some allegorical elements of the story. The title directly references the myth of Prometheus,
which we talked about last time.
Yeah, right. There's the idea of hubris in creation. There's the idea of tragedy of the fact that, humanity is fucking garbage and they can't realize that this ugly, huge guy that just wants to help out isn't actually a bad guy. There's a lot of things in there, but at the end of it, it's a story about people. It's not using fantastic concepts to explore ideas as a means to an end. The story is really about humanity and the human condition, and it uses the scientific ideas to more explore that through its characters, which are more than just brief sketches of some kind of philosophical idea or a group of people to make fun of.
Well, and that's something that we're going to start seeing later on, is that humanity becomes, and existentialism becomes a huge part of the sci-fi genre, especially later on. And I think, oh gosh, I have so many notes, guys.
Yeah, I'm on a computer. I wouldn't say it's new, but it's new to me. So I'm just kind of getting the hang of it.
It's kind of the way I am with my laptop right now.
But I got a lot of notes in front of me because the These are pretty dense text, and Frankenstein isn't
It is.
the most densest thing that Shelley wrote. Last Man is far dense, which we'll get into later. But there's a lot going on. It's relatively short. It's under 200 pages, but it explores a lot of ground, and there's a lot of ideas to really unpack here.
Oh,
Well,
yeah.
so one of the biggest differences that people probably who haven't read the novel don't know is that what we're going to see in the play adaptation at the end of our discussion are the differences that make the novel so different from what we see on screen and on stage. Because the monster is abandoned. He doesn't fight. He is born. He doesn't do anything except exist in his own skin, which is yellow, not green, which he's black hair. He's not bald. And he doesn't have electrodes coming out of his skin. He's a translucent, yellow-eyed being that looks otherworldly and yet becomes otherworldly in the amount of humanity he gains. And I don't think that that is ever exemplified in any of the recreation, well, in many of the adaptations of the novel, that really need to hold in this, how we look at this novel right now.
We'll get into the specific adaptations later, but I have a lot of leeway when it comes to my personal enjoyment of adaptations of films, but the one thing that almost all of them omit is an intelligent creature. And that's what absolutely changes the story from a generic, monster runs amok, he needs to be killed, to a tragedy.
Yeah, for sure.
That is omitted by pretty much everything. And I mean, some of the minor subplots that are also omitted in a lot of the adaptations, like the Arctic Voyage, the Justine subplot, the desire for a mate.
Those trials are really tense, but especially the Justine trial.
Yeah.
And this is my impression of Frankenstein this time was very different from my early 20s impression of Frankenstein. I really spent my entire time reading it this time feeling very pissed off with Victor, and just like everything he did was wrong, and maybe not even the scientific work that he did was probably the least wrong thing that he did. I mean, obviously that's the whole thing that sets everything in motion. But I don't know how much of this is Mary and how much of this is Percy, because apparently Percy actually did believe in a much more mechanistic kind of non-divine sort of universe.
We'll be charitable here and give all the credit to Mary.
Yeah, well, I want to. But so I don't know how much of this is, but I feel like she's not at all saying that the scientific work that he did was bad. She's saying that the fact that he just wanted to do this thing and not think about what the future would mean or how he could possibly better things, was his fault. And that was his presumption. That was his hubristic act. The fact that he, for example, towards the conclusion of his long, tragic family saga, he's about to get married. Now, the foolishness of this, even in the outset, we could go there too. I mean, he knows that this creature is stalking him. This is basically the horror essence of Frankenstein, which is also missed by many of the adaptations, actually, even though they may be more horror in essence in what the monster maybe does. But this is basically a story about a guy getting stalked. He never, even though Shelley goes out of her way to describe the monster as sort of big and hulking, it's also very fast-moving and supple, and it hides very well. So even though it's always around, nobody sees it unless it wants them to.
He's smart too. The monster plays psychological
smart
games and fucks with Victor like all the time. He's playing head games, getting in his space. He's really trying his hardest to creep him out. And the thing is, he tells him, like, I'll see you on your wedding night. Like, if that's not a hard threat that he should be afraid of, And
here's another stupid thing that Victor did. So when the monster says to him, I'll see you on your wedding night, or I'll be with you, is what he says, Victor assumes, fucking idiot that he is, he assumes that means the monster is gonna, pounce on him in his sleep and kill him. He doesn't have he's a smart man, maybe, but he doesn't have the psychological intuition or intelligence to realize, no, the monster's going to go after his bride-to-be because that's what he refused to give to the monster itself.
Right.
One thing I thought was interesting, too, Shelley is very, very canny about all this because the monster wants him to create a bride for himself, which is actually, it's interesting because a lot of people forget that that's in the book. They think that that was actually created by a Universal movie and that Shelley had nothing to do with that. Of course, in the book, the bride is never finished, but the monster wants him to do that, and Frankenstein, well, really Shelley, but Frankenstein actually does have a moment of intuition where he thinks about this, and he thinks about what might actually happen. And of course, because he's afraid of everything and because he's such a weakling and a pissant, he basically just starts to think about all the horrible things that could happen. And one of the things he thinks is, what if they don't like each other? What if they hate each other? And of course, we'll talk about that in one of the adaptations that I just watched the other day.
That's a huge part of it, though. He was so worried that the monster wouldn't like the bride, that he wouldn't complete the bride, even giving that idea a chance because, and we can talk about tropes now, too. Victor being the blueprint for the frustrated and all-knowing superiority scientists that are more worried about the consequences, that, like, he's trying to take his responsibility out of it. I can't create this because they're not going to like each other. That means he even thinks that he has, like, he knows best. And again, it comes down to that trope of the misunderstood, complex, self-indulgent, disruptive scientist. That he thinks he knows better than even the monster himself, which that could have worked. You don't know.
Yeah, that's one element that I thought kind of takes me out of the story is he's ruminating about, what if these two monsters breed and create a race of devils that's going to wipe out humanity?
I thought that was cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's but at the same time, a couple years prior, Napoleon just swept across the continent and he got brushed off by the Russians. So I think our friends to the east would make short work of the devils if it ever came to that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about
by the way, I don't actually think that I don't think that Victor destroyed the bride because he thought his original creature wouldn't like her. I just think that was one thing that he thought of. I think that it's just another example of Victor being afraid.
Selfish. He was selfish. I'm afraid of my own creations. I'm afraid of the consequences of my own creations, and yet I am compelled to create them and even destroy them. But I'm still going to attempt to create just to destroy it at the last minute. Like, he put together a bride and then went, oh shit, you're not so pretty, and then took it apart.
Yeah, it was, I mean, like, the first time he did it, he did it because of the impetus of his own brain, and he went a little bit further. But then he was really, it was really funny. It reminded me of some horror stories where the guy is up to some weird, no good necrophiliac shit or something, and then a family member knocks on the door, and he's like, "Oh, just a minute," and
we'll
he
get
tries
into
to
that
act
with the
like
adaptations because trust me, there are some great adaptations that really exemplify this.
And it's a time-old comic scene.
What about the monster trope? So I have a very important relationship with the monster. It's a personal relationship. Reading the monster, knowing myself as a very outsider kid and an outsider adult. I don't have friends. I'm ugly. Like, I'm not I feel a lot akin to this monster. And I think that in science fiction in general, we do have that sympathy with the outsider not being understood. And that's a really big trope that is created in this book.
Yeah, absolutely. She's like 150 years before her time on this.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So the monster is innocent. He is ugly.
He's not totally innocent, but
he is innocent when he is created. And
he's
what
born
he
of innocence.
does, he seeks knowledge. He is alone. He understands himself like a teenager would. Oh shit, I'm actually ugly. and then goes into a repressed state and like isolates himself. I'm not that pretty. People are going to be scared of me. He is the first goth kid we ever meet. The black hair, the white skin. He's reading Byron and Yeats, and he's all into the gothy shit.
Oh yeah, his reading list is great too. It's an excerpts of Plutarch's Lives, Paradise Lost, and a Goethe novel I've never read, but I'm sure it's great.
Of this, so I haven't read it, but I know a bit of the history of this book. This book is called The Sorrows of Goethe, and it was written by Goethe himself. This was probably, and I'm going to take a wild guess here, but this was probably the origin of the idea of the fateful book that destroys you on reading it. In other words, this might be the antecedent of the King in Yellow and the Necronomicon and all this shit. Basically, this book is a tragic story about a man, presumably Goethe himself, who consistently failed at love. And apparently the book was so depressing that there was actually an epidemic of suicides where people would they would like drown themselves with this book, which had a very distinctive yellow binding in their hands. I don't know how apocryphal that is, but it's a pretty cool story. So this is one of the books that Frankenstein read. Frankenstein's creature read.
So the creature himself is this misunderstood, born of innocence, completely wanting love, and he wants knowledge, and he wants to read, and he understands nature and poetry and love, and all of his actions are driven by the need to be understood and accepted, and nothing more. And we see this as adolescents, we see this as adults, we see this continue actually on in many science fiction novels. From here on out, this becomes the monster trope. Is that a monster because it's its nature? Is that a monster because it's sad? Is it a monster because you don't understand it? And that's where this one lies. It's just a monster because no one gets to know him. Yeah, and of course, Plutarch's Lives, I really don't know anything about. But of course, Paradise Lost, is the story that begins with just after Lucifer's fall from heaven, and describing his entourage and describing his deeds and how he feels it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven and all that. And then goes on to describe the fall of man. And that's also perhaps a somewhat, okay, so this thing about the really smart monster, I really like it. It is unrealistic. I just don't think that much time has passed. But then again, we don't know. This creature has apparently superior physical capacity, so perhaps it has a superior brain as well that can pick up on.
Presumably, he's not putting in a baby's brain in the head. He's putting like a fully formed adult brain. And while I agree that Paradise Lost and Plutarch and Goethe would probably be advanced text for us. I certainly didn't read any of those until my 30s. But, back in the day, they used to work educated people a lot harder. And it seemed like if you could read back then, you probably knew a fair amount.
Yeah, but this creature actually taught himself to read while doing his kind of half in the shadows hiding thing. The only person that he sort of showed himself to was the blind guy. By the way,
let's talk about women right there, because women of this era were able to read, but they weren't able to be smart. And I think the monster might be Mary Shelley in some ways.
Yeah, and it is definitely manifested itself in the fact that out of all the stories we've covered so far, I did extensive research on the amount of travelers' stories, and we couldn't cover them all. But I was only able to find one written by a woman, which is Margaret
Cavendish.
Yeah. So we might cover that one at a later date. But as far as I can tell, Shelley is really the second woman to write kind of in this genre. And you don't see a lot of women authors exploring the more mathematical and the scientific side of things. A lot of the women authors around this time wrote Gothic fiction. pretty much every major influence in the genre, including Shelley's own mother, but people like Anne Radcliffe, the Bronte sisters, even Jane Austen parodies it a bit. A lot of them were women writing that kind of fiction.
So the interesting thing about that, Shelley, of course, Mary, also was writing Gothic fiction, and there were this was such a strong movement in the late 18th, early 19th century that a very specific set of subtrends started to come up revolving around the Gothic genre. One of these trends was called the Gothic explique. I don't know if this is probably a somewhat retroactive term, but this would include Anne Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho, and this is basically a Gothic story where there's tons of weird supernatural stuff happening. It seems very fantastic and strange, but then at the end it gets explained as something completely natural. And the whole thing behind everything that seems so weird and supernatural was in fact, some guy playing tricks or somebody sort of trying to drive somebody insane or some
cut
other.
Her own self down doing that, and I think that's what women of the time did. Women still do that, and I think that needs to be really addressed. Is that the monster itself is extremely intelligent and is not beautiful, but has a lot to offer and does understand all of these things and does read these things and does write these things and does think about these things. But men were not able to understand that women were capable of doing these things. And I think that when you look at the monster, oh, well, it can't do that because it's an ugly monster. Well, you can't do that because you're pretty and you've got boobies. And I think that that's where that feminism comes into, and it's always a subtext.
So I didn't necessarily think about it as a woman angle, but that is an interesting point of view, and I can sort of see.
I'm a woman.
Yeah, I know, and that's an interesting thing. So what Mary did, and what probably makes this the first science fiction novel for real, she took the Gothic explique, and instead of having this be the big revelation at the end to prove the naturalness of all the strange things that you're seeing, she puts it at the beginning. She gets it out of the way immediately. The actual the whole thing around the creation of the monster and everything around that actually is very short compared with the rest of the book. So she gets that out of the way immediately, and that is unusual. So right now, I think we may have hit upon the one thing that really, really set this book completely apart.
What was Nate going to say? Because Nate, you were about to say something. So you want to finish your thought?
Yeah, sorry, I cut you off, Nate, because I was trying to make that point earlier.
Oh, it's fine. I was just saying in regards to gender and authorship, Frankenstein was initially published anonymously, I believe. So was The Mummy. And the only reason The Blazing World wasn't is because Margaret Cavendish was a noble lady. She held a title. I think she was Lady of Newcastle.
Sorry, you said The Mummy. You mean, what was Cavendish's book called?
No, I mean The Mummy. The Mummy was initially published anonymously.
Okay.
Cavendish was not published anonymously, I don't believe, but the reason is likely because she held a title. She was the Lady of Newcastle. So,
by the way, we haven't even mentioned The Mummy yet on the podcast. That's coming up next podcast.
Yeah, sorry. Getting ahead of myself. But a lot of women who wrote in the 19th century about more serious issues, I was talking to you guys about Middlemarch earlier, they wrote under a male-sounding pseudonym. If you pick up a book by George Eliot, it's not going to sound like a woman wrote it, even though it tackles, very serious adult contemporary issues, not adult contemporary like bad music, but you know what I'm trying to get at. So I mean, they were even shamed and suppressed into their own thoughts on how they published. They weren't able to publish under their own identity, and I don't think it was until after Frankenstein became a popular sensation through the staging, which we'll get to later, that she was able to actually put it under her own name. I'm not entirely clear on the publication history of which editions bore which name or what, but I think the first couple were anonymous.
Yeah, they were. So, I read a little bit about this, and I think it wasn't until 1931 that the book was published, 1831, I'm sorry, that the book was published under her name. But that was
I think the 1823 version might have been published under her name, but definitely not the 1818 version.
But the point is the 1831 version is the one that most of us have read.
Yeah.
And that one wasn't published with her name on the jacket until after the play adaptation had success.
And
Right.
it ran for about 10 years.
And really, to be honest, that tradition of women having to hide their true names was, I mean, maybe in mainstream literary fiction, it wasn't so much of a thing, but certainly in science fiction, unfortunately, not to say that everyone did this, but right up until, the 60s, even 70s, some women did feel they had to do that. In the 30s and 40s, it was Catherine Lucille Moore. Later on, there was James Tiptree, whose name is really...
I still feel like doing this. I still feel like curtailing what I have to say because I'm afraid of not being taken seriously.
Yeah, and authors still publish under male-sounding pseudonyms today. I mean, it's not like 50 Shades of Grey is great literature, but, E.L. James, there's kind of a reason why it's a gender-neutral sounding name.
Really?
Right, and yes, and I think that this goes on and on and on. Like,
yeah, but romance writers always, I don't know, it seems like a different thing.
It's easy to sit there and say that a woman can write romance because they all love love. That's what we love. But they never really validate us as thinking critical and analytical beings that understand these things because of the place that we've been put in. And let's start to talk about that. Like, you're not going to see a lot of females and you're not going to see a lot of people of color or a lot of different authors of different races until later because of this oppression and this stigma that is attached to people that you don't, that the readers don't, that the audience doesn't feel are going to be valid.
Right. And there's even areas of conservative right-wing type literature that are still around today, like Westerns and action novels and things like that. And one that was published recently called Trigger Warning. So you could kind of get what the book is about, this kind of anti-political correctness thing. It's a really bad action movie or action book on college
it's
campus.
actually a novel.
Yeah, it's something that actually exists.
Okay.
But it's marketed
I thought this was like some Ann Coulter style rant.
No. It's a novel that exists.
Okay.
But it's marketed to that crowd, but it's written under a male name by a woman to specifically appeal to that demographic and hide their sex while writing, this kind of retrograde conservative nonsense.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Well, but this is a reality. And I mean, even today, we have not been able to have a voice. And you can say there's a lot of sci-fi writers. Yeah, sure. And there's a lot of black writers, and there's a lot of... we have looked. We did, actually, in our research, look for books of the pre-Shelley era that were written by people that weren't just European. And we didn't find that. And we're not going to find that. And we're not going to find a lot of women. We're going to find some. But it's because there's a stigma attached to people that they think can write science or can write politics, and those that they think can't.
Yeah, and I think going forward, as much as we can, we're going to try to integrate those voices into our themes as we structure episodes, and not just kind of ghettoize them into just an off episode. All right, today we're doing the women.
So
and we're not doing that to earn points from anyone. We just think it's cool. So
as far as Frankenstein goes, do we feel that we've talked enough, or do we have more to say?
I wanted to actually, because you were talking about the outsider nature, and some of the things you were saying were leading me onto this point. But I want to read what I think is the central theme that resonates with me, and I think with you as well, from a lot of the things you were saying, Anne, about this book. And this is a quote from what is in the 1818 edition, Volume 3. This is actually an excerpt. It's a bit long, so bear with me, but I think this really encapsulates everything. So this is from when Frankenstein meets his creation up on the mountaintop, where he has sort of taken solitary refuge after the death of William and Justine. And he is now sort of angsting and feeling bad about himself, even though he never spoke up and he never did anything constructive. And he was actually talking to himself, and his creation was listening to him. So then he comes bounding towards him and approaches him. He doesn't realize it's his monster at first, but then he does, and of course, he's horrified. He feels like he wants to destroy it, and like he wants to show his manhood all of a sudden and attack it, which of course is fruitless. So, this is what he says. "Devil!" I exclaimed. "Do not dare approach me! And do not you fear the fierce vengeance of my arm wreaked on your miserable head! Begone, vile insect! Or rather stay, that I may trample you to dust! And oh, that I could, with the extinction of your miserable existence, restore those victims whom you have so diabolically murdered." "I expected this reception," said the demon. "All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature, to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us. You purpose to kill me. How dare you sport thus with life? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine toward you, and the rest of mankind. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them and you at peace. But if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends. Abhorred monster! Fiend that thou art! The torturers of hell are too mild a vengeance for thy crimes. Wretched devil, you reproach me with your creation? Come on then, that I may extinguish the spark which I so negligently bestowed." My rage was without bounds. I sprang on him, impelled by all the feelings which can arm one being against the existence of another. He easily eluded me and said, "Be calm. I entreat you to hear me. Before you give vent to your hatred on my devoted head, I have not suffered enough that you seek to increase my misery. Life, although it may only be an accumulation of anguish, is dear to me, and I will defend it. Remember, thou hast made me more powerful than thyself. My height is superior to thine, my joints more supple. But I will not be tempted to set myself in opposition to thee. I am thy creature, and I will be even mild and docile to my natural lord and king, if thou wilt also perform thy part, that which thou owest me. O Frankenstein, be not equitable to every other, and trample upon me alone, to whom thy justice and even thy clemency and affection is most due. Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel, whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall after be virtuous."
Okay, so at that point...
Yeah, that's some nice acting.
That's some very nice acting.
I just have one or two quick things before we move on from Frankenstein, more planting seeds for what's to come. The idea of Frankenstein being an electrical reanimation is almost completely absent in the novel, and we'll get into that in later adaptations.
Yeah.
And one interesting thing that I also think is omitted from almost all adaptations is the framing of the Arctic voyage in the beginning, which is kind of a precursor to future adventure stories of the Arctic and the Antarctic being this kind of unknown land that we have to get to. It's not really that touched upon in the novel, but it's in kind of an interesting framing device.
We've just completed our discussion on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now we're going to look at her second novel that was published in 1826 called The Last Man. And this is an apocalyptic novel. And this is significant to science fiction because it's one of the first apocalyptic, futuristic novels that we see. This isn't a crazy world. This isn't a journey. This is our future. And it's marked by plague, war, pestilence, and the complete annihilation of the human race. The Last Man was suppressed because people at that time, being very religious, saw it as prophecy and suppressed it until about 1960 when it was republished under the same title, The Last Man. So let's start talking about The Last Man. I have a few things to say about The Last Man, I think.
I think we all do.
So let's start off with the obvious, I guess. The novel is very clearly an allegory using the plague for Shelley losing everything. So Frankenstein was written at a point in her life when she had everything. You know, she was hanging out with these hot young poets who were on the verge of this new literary moment. And
it was pretty bad still though, because she lost her first child. Her second child actually died while Percy was off having an affair with another woman.
That aside, The Last Man, she had already lost 4 of her 5 children.
And after her children passed, her husband Percy Shelley died in a boating accident, and Lord Byron, who was present with the writing of Frankenstein and a mentor and lifelong friend to the Shelleys, died of, I think it was tuberculosis, while fighting for Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire. And you can see Shelley really feeling totally despondent throughout the entire novel. Her entire world has collapsed around her. And this seems like her outlet.
Quickly, just for people who haven't read it, The Last Man, in Volume 1, it's 3 volumes. In Volume 1, they go over the relationships. By the end of Volume 1, things start to take a little bit of a turn. But in Volume 1, you really get a sense of who people are, and that's what we're going to discuss. In Volume 2, the plague begins. And the plague starts to ravage, Europe and Greece and the Americas. By the end of Volume 2, we have cataclysmic events occurring throughout the globe. And by the middle of Volume 3, we start to see the breakdown of all society and everything, to the point where when the end of the book happens, the lead character ends up alone. And that is why it is called The Last Man, because it shows not a post-apocalyptic, but an apocalyptic view of how the end of times basically occurs, with plague, with war, with cataclysms of nature, and then with the ending of the human race. So with that, let's get into it.
Yeah, so the main character, Lionel, as you mentioned, is very much a stand-in for Shelley herself. And the major people in her life, namely her husband Percy Shelley and her mentor Lord Byron, are represented through the characters of Adrian and Lord Raymond, respectively. Another character in her life, presumably, at least I think, is Ada Lovelace, is represented in the character of Clara, who in the novel is Raymond's daughter. In real life, Ada Lovelace was Lord Byron's daughter. Ada was still alive at the time of publication, even though she also died young. I think Mary Shelley outlived her. She's kind of developed a cult following in literature at this point. But this is, I think, if it's representing her anyway, probably the first depiction of her in literature as a genius child teenager who has a very kind heart. Clara almost seems to be more important to the main character than his own children.
Do you guys really, I don't know, like, this might be just me, but, and I may be colored by all the things that I've been reading about them lately and about things that happened, but do you really think that Adrian is Percy? I'm not so sure.
I think it's pretty clear that...
they die in the exact same way.
They die in the exact same way. The depictions The way
I don't know,
that
it
he
just...
described the way that he relates to her is
Just that-
very much that.
The way that she writes about him, he can do no wrong. He is so perfect and awesome.
Yeah, that's an
I don't-
abusive relationship. Hello.
Yeah,
He
but
was
I don't
cheating
think...
and she loved him anyway.
Right, and,
yeah.
and keep in mind, Percy was her father's student that ran off with a daughter, so there's obviously a power imbalance at the beginning of their relationship to begin with.
And
Yeah.
Percy ran off with
But do you
Mary
think
Shelley
that
at age
Mary would have been a
16?
bit more disillusioned by the time she wrote?
No, I think
The
she
Last
was in
Man?
the throes of grief.
Right, she was incredibly bitter and despondent throughout this entire process. I mean, even in the first
Yes.
volume where it's establishing the characters, who they are, everything is so incredibly dramatic. Everybody has these really intense feelings over these really minor incidents, and like, there's one point where the main
I actually
character-
loved that, but it
Yeah,
took me
it-
forever to get through. But I loved it.
Nate, go ahead and finish your thought there.
Yeah, there was this one incident where Lionel like abandoned society to just go live in the forest, and somebody's mocking him later, say, "Oh, you're not going to turn squirrel again in Windsor Forest."
Well, so here's the thing with Mary Shelley being the lead character in this novel, Lionel. She has literally lost 4 children, a husband, her best friend. This is also the end of the Romantic era. And she herself is becoming an antiquated part of that. As we usher in the Victorian era and then the new age of technology, what was happening to her was complete isolation. And when you read the first volume, and I can attest to this as a person who's gone through this type of thing, this is what you feel like when you go through loss. You become hard. She describes everybody becoming, oh, my sister would have been nice if she wasn't so hurt and abused and used and neglected. They would have done so many better things if they weren't so hardened. We saw this in Frankenstein's monster as well. That it wasn't. This is a nature versus nurture type of argument that she is posing here.
Yeah, and I think going back to what you were saying about it being the end of the Romantic era and a new age being ushered in, you can see that in the fact that the novel was almost immediately suppressed. And it was read by virtually nobody for more than 100 years. It wasn't republished until sometime in the 1960s.
It was 1960.
1960, okay.
Yeah.
Do you guys think that she... do you guys think that she might have slightly anticipated that, and that's perhaps why she decided to set it in 2090 something, despite the fact that there's really not that much to indicate that it's the distant future?
I mean, I guess in a sense she's playing around with ideas like that. The only future tech that I could find in the novel was it seems like commercial air travel by balloon exists.
I don't think she cares about any of that. I'm just wondering if she might have done that specifically because she anticipated running into problems. So she thought maybe if I set this 200 years in the future, people won't be so upset.
No, I don't think that she saw that far in advance. And here was my problem with Volume 1. One, I'm not very emotionally available in that way that I want to read about it. But I enjoyed it. What I had a problem with as far as a sci-fi novel is that it was, like you say, set in 2070, 2073?
Yeah, pretty far in advance.
Way far in advance, and yet she doesn't allude to advancements. What she does is anchor it in real-time relationships, which, I'm sorry, aren't going to change much regardless of where we are in space and time.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
If you compare it to something like The Mummy, which we'll be talking about later, there's really not a lot of...
We're not going to do that until later.
No, but that's an example of something written around the same time where she really goes wild with all the imaginations of what the future might hold. It's not nearly as well written a book as this, but the point is that she really...
of this novel. The point of Volume 1 was an exercise. It was a cathartic release. It was an expression of loneliness and of understanding the end of a time within yourself.
And also to glorify Percy and Lord Byron.
Yeah.
You know,
Did anyone else think Lord Byron would be more of an antagonistic figure when they started it.
Well, she had this very, I don't know, when you realize that it's very clearly Lord Byron and the relationship, he gets a very sympathetic portrait, which he doesn't necessarily get in other forms of literature.
But the funny thing is, the way she describes him at first, I immediately thought, oh, this guy's going to be real trouble. And it turns out that because of the love that he felt for Lionel's sister, that actually ended up being completely negated. He wasn't even that interested in being Lord Protector of England in the end, which seemed to be his chief ambition. I just got the impression that he was going to be a real problem for everybody. And the way she described him in the beginning was like, yeah, this guy is trouble. He's no good. And then as it went on, it's like, actually, no, he's not so bad.
I do see him.
He's done great things for the Greek independence and all this stuff, and he's good.
I saw him as trouble.
Yeah, and I see him as some kind of guy that bows over everybody with their bullshit, even though they're an abrasive, abusive figure. And the person who's most bowed over by their bullshit is, Mary Shelley, Lionel themselves. Yeah. And it's very apparent.
I guess you're right.
He was a very overbearing male abusive figure that has that hubris. He's almost like the Frankenstein character, really. Like, let's just put it that way, because he has this, I can do it, whatever. Yeah, I love you, but it wasn't. He's not a very developed character, in my opinion.
And I think they're very idolized versions of the real person. And
very
you can really
idolized.
see Mary Shelley's blinders on with that. And I mean, it's kind of hard to blame her due to her closeness with the figures involved, but the flaws are very apparent, and they're very idealized in a sense that they are very one-note characters, and you don't really get into the mindset of like identifying with Lyle and sympathizing with him over his adoration of both of these figures, because they both seem like assholes.
Well, and so this is the thing, is that Shelley, being analogous to Lionel, was really in subjugation and her adoration to these two strong male characters that exemplified like a lot of shit in her life that she was like trying to aspire to. I'm going to be enlightened. I can do that too. But they literally still had an oppressive nature over her, even though she was the last one to survive.
Right. And Lionel always feels like inherently inferior to the two. The other two had these like titles of nobility. Adrian was it Adrian that was related to the last queen or the king that abdicated? But Lionel was an ascendant of like somebody who was like a minor bureaucrat.
It all started out because there was a letter that was written by his father explaining all this stuff and basically begging for sympathy from the old monarchy. We may as well mention that even though Shelley doesn't actually prognosticate any tech other than very frequent balloon travel, she does actually say that by the 2090s, the royal family in England is abolished.
Well, I think she saw America and France and realized that the tide was turning.
Well, so here's the thing with when you get, so just for people who haven't read it, the first novel, again, is very emotional and very allegorical to her life. By the second novel, we get into a tonal shift. The entire tone of the novel and her writing shifts to prose, to description, to the vile.
To death.
To death. And she really goes into a beautiful description of like the pregnant sky and the swelling seas, and everything is vomiting forth. It's great.
She says in the beginning of volume 3, she said, sorry, this is actually from, the other quote, the longer one that I excerpted was from the beginning. This is from chapter 9.
And don't read it like you did the Frankenstein, because this is beautiful stuff, dude. So do it some good character.
This is short, but this is just, I felt that this book was so heavy that even though I was very, I was sort of drawn to the prose, if not the characters, it did take me, it was very ponderous, and it took me a while because of the way I feel and the way that I respond to emotions. So, but this is just an example of how heavy this is. She says, "Now, soft a while, have I arrived so near the end? Yes. It is all over now. A step or two over those new-made graves, and the wearisome way is done. Can I accomplish my task? Can I speak my paper with words capacious of the great conclusion? Arise, black melancholy, quit thy Cimmerian solitude. Bring with thee murky fogs from hell, which may drink up the day. Bring blight and pestiferous exhalations, which, entering the hollow caverns and breathing places of earth, may fill her stony veins with corruption, so that not only herbage may no longer flourish, the trees may rot, and the rivers run with gall. But the everlasting mountains be decomposed, and the mighty deep putrefy, and the genial atmosphere which clips the globe lose all powers of generation and sustenance. Do this, sad-visaged power, while I write, while eyes read these pages. And who will read them? Beware, tender offspring of the reborn world. Beware, fair being, with human heart, yet untamed by care, and human brow, yet unplowed by time. Beware, lest the cheerful current of thy blood be checked, thy golden locks turn gray, thy sweet dimpling smiles be changed to fixed, harsh wrinkles. Let not day look on these lines, lest garish day waste, turn pale and die. Seek a cypress grove, whose moaning boughs will be harmony befitting. Seek some cave, deep embowered in earth's dark entrails, where no light will penetrate, save that which struggles, red and flickering, through a single fissure, staining thy page with grimmest livery of death.
Ooh.
And that's
Girl, I'm going to tell you like this. That is way bigger than the quote I picked, which was really, really poignant to me.
I got chills reading that.
No. Assuredly, a most benign power built of this majestic fabric we inhabit, and the laws by which it ensues, by the laws by which it is evident, is the war we wage. We live in a benign power that was built up, this majestic fabric, and we inhabit it, and yet we destroy it. I think that was all we needed. I needed to fall in love with this novel, was just a simple, quick beauty of life that we are constantly destroying.
Yeah.
There are so many passages redolent with sorrow and disappointment, and just basically the feeling of the burden of time and degradation of things that we hold dear. There's another passage that's really long that I'm not going to quote
about
because
what we're going through now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many parallels to the modern world.
Yeah, so let's diverge from the constructs that she was building and start to look at the parallels that we're living. And we have plague.
Yeah.
We have social unrest. So, we have all this. But it came from, but the most important thing that we need to start to look at is not that it prophesizes what we're going through now. It tells of the past that has already happened. The Napoleonic Wars. That's the warfare she got for this novel. She had that volcano she talks about in Frankenstein, blacking out the sun, making an Arctic summer.
She does, yeah.
Then she's also talking about a plague, not a future plague, but a plague that was still in the context of her social understanding. The Black Plague, Scarlet Fever, Rubella, you name it. It's not like she's seeing the future. She's telling you what she's already seen.
And it's amazing how society never changes. So with the modern coronavirus pandemic,
which
a lot of
right
countries like the United States thought, oh, it'll never happen here. That's problems for over there. We don't need to take this seriously.
it can't happen here. That
Right.
was what St. Clair Lewis's novels.
Yeah, and I mean
That's-
the same sentiments expressed by the English in The Last Man. It's not the plague that initially disrupts English
Yeah.
society. It's the waves of Irish and American refugees coming over in droves, escaping the plague from their areas. And even then, the English are almost blind to the fact that, hey, this shit isn't just a problem with the foreigners. Death is coming for everybody.
yeah.
Well, and
Did you guys think it was weird that the Americans came though? Like,
Oh, it's,
Why
it's,
would
it's
they
a
do
great
that?
inversion of how history played out. I mean, with the Irish potato famine and lots of
Yeah.
Irish immigrants coming to America, here we have lots of American immigrants coming to Ireland and disrupting society. It's
Well,
actually
the thing is, to her, that's why I think it's so a period piece, because even in the future, it is still very English. It's very England at that time period.
oh, absolutely.
And so I think that she's trying to make that reality
yeah.
very palpable for her readers. So, she understands this is a now thing. These are accidents, or not accidents. These are missteps by the government who failed to see, to help, to proactively change. And that is what leads to their end.
Yeah, and there's some also very, I guess, monastical overtones in here where they play with the idea of abolishing the monarchy, but characters of, Adrian Raymond are glorified as, of course they're nobles. They're these inherently good people who are going to take care of all of us. And they see society collapses under this ineffectual Republican government. Of course these peons can't foresee the coming calamity. We need royal blood. We need noble lineage to really guide society. And those attitudes really come out in
I
the
didn't
novel.
get where she was going with that at first. I have to admit,
But
and
that's what
eventually
we're
I
dealing with.
got it. But I kind of feel like at first she was coming down more on the Republican side, and
Yeah,
then
that's what I
like
thought too. But-
Understand, though, that the Republicans then are not what Republicans or Republic is now.
Right,
So we have to
capital R, small r,
contextualize it.
Republican.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a completely different
of course
type of-
that's only an American thing.
Well, and unfortunately, American things have a bad tendency to become world things. And
yeah, maybe, but
speaking on behalf of all 350 million Americans, I apologize.
Okay.
I
but
second that.
no, I just thought that at first, I don't know, I guess just because of my personal interpretation of Byron being kind of like the bad guy at first, which turned out not to be true. I felt like she was actually supporting the anti-royalist side more so, even though, Lionel was kind of not necessarily that way, but Adrian was. Adrian was totally for the anti-royals in the beginning,
John,
remember?
that becomes a moot point because they all die. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter. Like
I know. But that was the whole purpose of Volume 1, right? And
No,
so,
the purpose of Volume 1 was to give homage to what she had and what she lost and why she was writing this novel. This wasn't because it was end of times. This was because it was the end of her. And
so what you're saying is I shouldn't think very much about the politics.
I didn't think very much about the politics. What I thought, it was a secondary aspect to it, and I would never focus on it. I think what was really clear was the personal journey of loss, neglect, and aloneness.
Well,
And
the
we
politics
saw
are really only part of the first volume. So after that, they go away pretty much because
in
everybody's...
Volume 2 and 3, what do we deal with? Death and loneliness, and the subsequent...
The grand leveler supplants all political
the
means.
sequential loss. So wait, the only reason she had to set up Volume 1 was to show there was a purpose to the sequential loss that she felt as a person and how it affected her in becoming a lone being. And this was an allegorical statement to that. And everything that she felt was allegorical to that. Loss. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I guess the situation that she did describe in Volume 1, exactly, this future situation that she envisioned, but she didn't really spend a lot of time on it, so I guess that's my clue that I shouldn't really spend a lot of time on it either. It just seemed interesting to me because I thought that she was sort of pointing a certain way, and then in the end, I guess when times are rough, when times are really bad, maybe these symbols of royalty and symbols of like the aristocracy, they kind of started to mean more again, but then in the end it was all pointless anyway because everybody died.
They all died. And
yeah.
the point of Volume 1 was to set up the sequential loss to her and the loss to the Romantic era.
I did kind of expect Clara to live because Ada Lovelace was alive during the time of publication, but I kind of respect Shelley for being like, nah, fuck it, she is.
Yeah.
Maybe she wanted her to die? Like, I don't know. Oh, here's my little weirdness. Okay, so you know how in real life she has 4 of her children die and then she has 1 left. So she's left with a child.
Which is good.
Yeah, and I mean, the relationship between her and her children comes off really odd in the novel. Like, as I was saying earlier, Clara has so much more, on-screen time is, the bad way to phrase it. But you know what I mean? She's described a lot more. She's a larger part of the story and the action than any of her children.
Yeah.
And I think that's just kind of odd.
My favorite point about her being left with the little dog was, I don't know if you guys have had kids, but I have. And I work with kids. And one of the biggest things is they're cute. They hang out. They follow you everywhere.
Well, I don't have kids, but I have 2 little dogs.
So you know.
So I know.
Well, but when you're...
I had one once.
So the way she was even left, if she was allegorical for our main character in The Last Man, she was left with a puppy that needs her care.
Right, that's
that
a great
needs
point.
her guidance, that will follow her anywhere.
Yeah.
She is still a caretaker of this animal.
Yeah.
The animal becomes her companion, but she is still ultimately responsible for it. I saw that because I find myself with my daughters like that.
Yeah. That makes sense. So, what else?
Do we have anything else to conclude our Last Man discussion with?
I don't know if I have any other major points. I thought it was interesting that the Greek independence is really a thing on Shelley's mind in the novel. And obviously, like, Byron took a lot of passion for it because it's what he died for in real life. It's just kind of interesting that such a thing inspired Englishmen to the point where
they had to act on it.
Yeah.
And it is interesting, and that may actually come up again in a future podcast because we're going to be doing a certain book where I know that actually figures in when we start talking about Jules Verne, actually. But
okay.
So 20,000
what
Leagues.
is our next novel?
One thing that I want to mention that I actually really liked because it was something that sort of took me by surprise. But so when Lionel's wife, Idris, finally dies, he brings her back to Windsor Castle, which is where they've been staying a lot of this time. They kind of try to leave, and it doesn't quite work out at first. Eventually they do, but so he takes her back there, and her mother, who's kind of been like antagonistic to the whole marriage because he wanted her to marry Raymond, the Byron substitute, but his when she meets him in the church or the chapel, I think it is, I expected her to heap condemnations and curses on him, but instead, I think when she kind of she realized how deeply emotional he felt for the very first time in the entire book, she actually warmed towards him and started to like him and relate things to him. And all of a sudden, this woman who was so cold and aloof and antagonistic became something else. And the thing that pushed that into being was actually the death of her daughter. And I thought that was it was unexpected for me. And I thought it was actually a really nice touch. It's weird because I did not necessarily feel attached to any of the characters in this book, but I felt attached to the emotions themselves. And I think that's actually something that Shelley was very good at, and it may be actually a facet of the writing of that time, especially as well. But,
for Gothic novels, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really interesting that can happen because, these days, a lot of emphasis
I'm going to say, have you ever had a mother-in-law? That's exactly how it happens. When everyone dies, they're like, oh, girl, you're good now.
Well, actually, she never really liked me, but that's okay.
They don't like you until they do, because nobody ever wants to.
Right. But you don't expect them to start liking you when their kid dies. I don't know.
No,
it was
they
just
like you because their kid dies and you were the last tie.
and you're
child.
Suddenly it becomes apparent how devoted and good to them you actually were. And that's like it was just, I don't know. This book is so sorrowful and full of heavy like that part actually warmed me a little bit and made me feel like almost good. And it was a very strange moment because you expected that to be like the central anguish of the book where Idris dies, but actually it almost seemed to bring people more together. And I thought that was really cool. I liked that because I'm an emotional person at heart, and I just thought that was sweet.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the fact that this book, plot-wise, is rather disjointed. If you were to write it out plot-wise from beginning to end, like a lot of the structures don't really make a lot of sense. But prose-wise, this is,
fantastic.
In my opinion anyway, like leaps and bounds above Frankenstein. Like if you love gorgeous, emotional, passionate prose, this novel is full of it.
We're on part 3 of our Mary Shelley podcast, and we're going to be talking about the play Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein. And this...
Back to Frankenstein.
Yes, back to Frankenstein, because it's lighthearted and fun. So this play was written in 1823, so before The Last Man and after the initial publication of Frankenstein, but before the second publication of Frankenstein. And this one is by Richard Brinsley Peake. It had 37 runs, and then we had a revived show in 1850. So this is a highly significant adaptation because this is where we get a lot of the iconography, the tropes. What we think of Frankenstein comes from this adaptation. And Mary Shelley herself, I have it on my phone, I could look it up, but she actually reviews this piece and she loved it. She was like, why didn't I think of that? It's alive! Happens.
It's funny because there's not a lot of humor in Shelley, but this is full of humor.
This is full of humor. So some fun facts that I found out about the play. So Charles II had only awarded royal patents allowing plays at the royal theaters. So there was 4 exclusive royal theaters that were allowed to show plays. All other theaters had to have several things that weren't considered plays, royal plays, and those things included things that changed the face of this creation. Number 1, they had to have either burlesque, melodrama, pantomime, spectacle, puppet theater, or musical. And here's the thing. In the royal theaters, they could be plays in and of themselves, literary plays. But if it wasn't in the royal theater, and there's only 5 of them in England, everything else had to have one of these other components. So what's really cool about this play, and it changed, and really we can see this through all adaptations. Number one, it had to include, so this play had to include music, which we see in the songs. The creature responds to songs during this play. It had to have that in order to be played. And that changed a lot of what we see. It had to have pantomime. This is why the creature goes from being articulate to mute, which is an interesting thing because we will end up seeing this for the rest of the 20th century. And it had to have spectacle, which is why they had gunshots with avalanches, something big and catastrophic. So these are components that we see in the universal adaptations and every adaptation since then. But the mute monster, that was because pantomime was needed in order to show these plays. The songs were needed because they needed music or burlesque to show these plays. And there were oftentimes burlesque versions of these plays because they had to fall within these, what they considered less royal subgenres of theatrical performances than that were allowed in the royal theaters. So from this, let's take it away. So this is called The Presumption or the Fate of Frankenstein play. You guys want to start this off?
Yeah, this is definitely where the tropes of the popular version of Frankenstein come from. Even though the Universal film is adapted from a different play from 1927, I think. The idea of the eccentric servant of Fritz, the unintelligent creature, the creature being credited not as with a name, but in this version it's asterisked out, but in the Universal version it's a question mark. The major themes of the monster being self-aware and it more being a tragedy are totally eliminated here. Other themes that are omitted from pretty much every adaptation, the Justine side plot, the monster's desire for a mate, the Arctic voyage, it's all pretty much gone from here.
I think that this play is, Anne actually mentioned the pantomime, and I believe, from what I understand of the English pantomime tradition, this play definitely fits into that. It's not in the script itself, obviously, but you can imagine some serious audience participation going on when you read this play.
There's a lot of songs.
And there's a lot of songs, but I don't even just mean that, but I mean the humor of it. If you study a little bit of pantomime tradition, there are certain cues that the audience looks for, and they kind of respond en masse.
Well,
and I think
the point of mentioning it is that all of these things that we come to know and love and are iconic for our Frankenstein, it's alive, wasn't coined until this play. Igor, the assistant, that's stupid, wasn't created until this play. And the pantomime of this stupid mute creature didn't happen
the essence of pantomime is actually audience participation. That is actually one of the essences of pantomime.
Well, I'm going to talk about Clerval being the only thing that brings community.
Yeah, he's very different in this.
He's also a thing that wasn't brought into the book. Clerval was his buddy who paid our quote-unquote Igor, Fritz, to go ahead, and what he does is provide the audiences with an in and a sense of community into looking into the isolation of our doctor. And
the novel doesn't do that at all.
Yeah, so the novel is very isolating of our doctor, and we need to have these different characters to start to bring them in, and the whole point of the pantomime and everything is that these restrictions actually led to what we call iconic Frankenstein.
Yeah, and I think what you were saying with the It's Alive, which in the play is, It Lives, I think.
It lives!
Yeah, a
Sorry,
lot.
I have it written down. I have It Lives written down, but It's Alive.
No,
That's what I
It's
got.
Alive is what everybody knows. It's from the Universal one. It's from the 1990s one, even though that's the one that, stays the closest to the novel. But the attention given to the animation scene in the play is pretty much the entire first part of it. Frankenstein
Yeah.
stressing the fuck out, and like the servant is Fritz, who is introduced in this novel.
Who, by the way, is nothing but comic relief.
Yeah, right, exactly. But in the novel, Frankenstein tells you, I'm not even going to tell you anything about this because I don't want this recreated. He goes into absolutely no details about the reanimation process. He doesn't describe any of his equipment. The only clues we might have as readers to guess what the process might be is when he's in university, he says he's studying chemistry and chemical processes, and he mentions a bunch of alchemical, I wouldn't even call them scientists, occultists, transmutationists.
Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus and all that. Yeah.
Right. And I think it was only added in the 1831 edition where there's a brief sentence where young Frankenstein is visited as like a 7 or 8 year old by a foreigner who tells them about these new discoveries in electricity and galvanism, of course referencing Luigi Galvani's experiments with bioelectricism, essentially zapping frog legs and having them move that way.
And watching them twitch and being like, hey, this is the secret of life.
So this play adaptation, if I can, for our listeners who may not have read it, is humorous. It is got songs. It's very big. It's very over the top. It has some very characters that have like.
It's actually ridiculous.
It's ludicrous. It has a sense of absurdism embedded into it. It's fun to read, you guys. You should read it. But what it does that is most important is that it takes us from a source material into a completely transmuted idea of what we think Frankenstein is. And Frankenstein has become a bobblehead on my car.
Yeah. And I mean, Frankenstein, the novel it's not a very long novel, but it's a very heavy novel. It makes you think about a lot of things.
There's a lot in there.
And the play doesn't do that. It's entertainment. No. And apparently what really captured viewers is the monster scared the shit out of people. And one thing that I really wanted to know that I couldn't find any information about is how they did the makeup and the costuming for these performances.
That would be cool to find out.
Some stuff about that.
Tell us.
Okay, so what I read was during all the scenes where he was like, that's why he had to scream, "It lives," is because all of the science took part off stage. And like, so it's like crash, 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 bang, bang, bang. And he goes, "It lives!
It lives!"
And that is your cue that the monster, but they didn't show any of it. They didn't show anything. And then the monster, and he was blue. He was considered a hobgoblin. He did not have electrodes on his neck. And he comes out, and he's like very tall with big stompy feet. And then he scares the audience because he's a very garish blue. And then he chases and has a fight scene with Frankenstein, his creator. So there you go. Yeah, that's what I read.
Wow.
Yeah, the electric angle really doesn't come up until much, much later. Even the Edison film doesn't really emphasize an electrical process. It's more like of a chemical spawning vat kind of thing.
Definitely in the Universal movies.
Our favorite adaptations with our spawning vats and our glowing green liquid. You guys know where I'm going to go with that one.
So let's go there.
So let's go there. This play was a great adaptation that totally changed. What makes a good adaptation is that it takes source material and it doesn't alter the feeling. It alters some of the bits to modernize it. Correct?
Yeah, I think trying to stick from one medium to the other, like adapting it one-to-one, which is what the 90s Brana film kind of attempted to do, it doesn't always work. Sometimes you're not going to be able to compress a novel, even a shorter novel like Frankenstein, into a format like a play or a film. You have to change it around a bit to make it work for the format. And I think the strongest adaptations are probably looser sourced from the novel and more do their own thing with the basic concepts rather than trying to stick to the letter of Shelley.
And I think
I think the play that we were talking about, the Presumption play, I think that the way that Richard Brinsley Peake does it is that he condenses it to the heart of what he thought was the most important element of Frankenstein. He places the DeLacy family basically in a real position of prominence, which they sort of have in the novel in that they were the creature's teachers, but their purpose in the play is completely different. They're basically like, they're sort of general audience surrogates, I guess. And, the whole story of, for some reason, it is interesting that he decided to retain the story of Safi and the treacherous Turk as being that important that it needed to be retained. No other adaptations that I know of actually retain that. It's actually central to the play in a way, although mostly it's central in the sense that characters talk about it. There's a lot of on-the-nose kind of, as you know, my father who was in prison, like there's a lot of that kind of dialogue. The play, to me, was a little bit ridiculous, but I really liked it. Like, it was fun. And the epic speech that Frankenstein gives before he brings the creature to life and then just basically runs away is pretty epic. I like that a lot. And, I think it was a lot of fun. It was ridiculous, but it was fun. I certainly, I don't know, the Kenneth Branagh movie, I don't actually know that much about, but I would think that there's still a possibility of a really good adaptation that's closer to the Shelley novel.
Yes, but Branagh's is not it. So I watched the Kenneth Branagh film, which is from 1994, I want to say, 94 or 93, somewhere in there. But it is the only adaptation that I know of that even attempts to stick to the main plot of the Shelley novel. And it really is rushed on the direction. Kenneth Branagh is a notorious overactor, which is also the case here. And even though there are some inspired performances, especially by Robert De Niro, who does a great creature, and the special effects and the costuming and the makeup here is really very good. It just doesn't overall work as a film. I think it tries to shove too much into 2 hours. And
it doesn't get the point.
Yeah, exactly. It feels like if you were watching it with a novel in mind, that they specifically scripted it to convey, like, this part from the novel. And the scenes exist to kind of move the novel's plot along. They don't really feel like organic interactions between people. And when the novel is so centered on humanity and the human aspect of wanting to be a part of society, wanting to be loved and cared for, just to rush through it super quick kind of misses a lot of the point. But I think there is definitely room for, especially nowadays where people are spending a lot of money adapting big budget stories over multiple seasons. My wife and I just finished the Netflix TV show Dark, which is a fantastic multi-season sci-fi
really
show. The Expanse is getting a lot of money and attention nowadays. Game of Thrones kind of set this whole ball rolling with modern big budget sci-fi fantasy being adapted. So I think it would be a no-brainer for somebody like a Netflix, somebody like an Amazon who has an unlimited budget to take a public domain source and
about that. Let's just shift gears a little bit, because if we're talking about adaptations and we're talking about iconic adaptations of our monster, my favorite, and that's on Netflix, is the Penny Dreadful Frankenstein's monster. It is so relevant to her original novel. He has black hair. He's like a goth kid with a trench coat. He's got translucent skin. superhuman strength, and he's not completely scarred and 8 feet tall, but my God, he could read a page of prose like nobody's business. He's all about romance and love and introspection. This Frankenstein's monster is probably one of the best and most authentically portrayed. He actually, in Penny Dreadful, that Frankenstein's monster is more akin to the original source material than any other adaptation of this monster I've ever seen.
I gotta watch more of that.
You don't,
sure.
but
Yeah,
if you do, take the Frankenstein into account. I mean, because it might be a little hokey for you, but the way that he talks, the way that he interacts, the way he emotes violently, the way he's born, the way he's neglected, and there's an entire episode dedicated to exactly what we read in the novel of him being an abandoned child made from the parts of man and not explained to what he is. I'm gonna just say that's my favorite depiction of the monster I've ever seen.
That's
I've
really
never
cool.
seen it myself, but I don't think hokey is necessarily a bad thing. I'm a big fan of Dark Shadows, and they do a Frankenstein arc where a creature and then a bride is created for him, and of course they take the names Adam and Eve, because why else?
Why wouldn't they?
That's hokey.
Yeah, right. The whole show is hokey.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, it's shot with the change you'd find in your couch as a budget.
Right? And
They
some
did
like Super 8.
5 episodes a week, so they were basically shooting everything live. So
Yeah.
the actors and actresses always fuck up their lines. There was one guy who was fired from being drunk on the set all the time, and you could really tell.
Was
when he
that the
losing
Reverend
pretty hard.
Trask actor?
No, it was a different guy. But Reverend Trask is a great over actor. He's a
He
fantastic
actually is
character.
in the audios.
Yeah.
Yeah, he actually does a really good job.
Yeah, no, the guy who got fired for being drunk passed away a long time ago. He's most famous role is probably the bad guy in the first Lethal Weapon movie, which is maybe not the kind of caliber actor here, but for favorite adaptations of Frankenstein, I think like every other American kid, I grew up with the 1931 Universal just as being the story.
Quintessential.
And I didn't read the novel until after I graduated college. So I was just blown away by the idea of an intelligent creature, because pretty much every other adaptation is a child's mind in this huge monstrous body that just rampages and
smoke
plows
good.
Well,
and kills its way through stuff. And
I actually found my quote from Mary Shelley writing to her late husband's friend about the play she saw. I found it. It's very long, so I'll go down a little bit to the It Lives part, because that's iconic for us as modern people.
Yeah.
The stage represents a room with a staircase leading to Frankenstein's workshop. He goes to it, and you see his light at a small window, through which a frightened servant peeps, who runs off in terror when Frankenstein exclaims, "It lives!" Presently, Frankenstein himself rushes in horror and trepidation from the room, and while still expressing his agony and terror, throws down the door of the laboratory, leaps to the staircase, and presents his unearthly and monstrous person to the stage. The story is not well managed, but Cooked played the monster's part extremely well. He's seeking as it were for support. He's trying to grasp at the sounds he heard. All indeed he does well, imagined and executed. I was much amused, and it appeared to excite a breathless eagerness in the audience. And I think that is what we all love, is the first showing of any monster, and Mary Shelley herself, of an adaptation that is completely divorced from what she wrote. That's the fact that the point was made that this grappling newborn creature of many parts of men was able to emerge and terrify the way it terrified her, as Nate said, in her dream in the very beginning, an animated life made of other men.
And the play was so successful at doing that that it ran for, I think, 27 years.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
I want to say the first performance was in 1823, and then the
Yeah, I
last
do have the
performance was in
dates.
1850.
No, hun. I actually had it here. It ran for 37 showings in 1827, I believe.
Yeah.
And then it had a revival in 1850, which it ran until like the film era.
Right, okay. Yeah. I know the initial actor did like 350 performances of it or something like that. And this isn't the only early adaptation of Frankenstein.
Not.
Stephen Earl Forey put together a very comprehensive list of all the dramatizations of Frankenstein. And the first existing surviving film adaptation of Frankenstein, I should say the earliest known, is Edison's Frankenstein. And before that point, there were 19 different stage adaptations.
But I did watch the other day, you saw I posted this on my page.
Yeah.
I did watch the 17-minute Edison film, which was, what year was that?
1910, I think?
1910, yeah, it was 1910. It was fantastic because it had to be brief, because he only had so much availability to film at that time. And I think, again, we see where it cuts and how it translates to film. And I really think that as we progress through our evolution of science fiction, we're going to see these book to film adaptations really taking the core components and making them visual, because they're so stunning and they're so shocking and they're so otherworldly and they're so amazing that you really can, when you're adapting a novel, you really can only take the best bits to get that value, that moment.
But what do you think those moments are up for debate? I mean, like, to me, the 1823 play, I really liked it. I thought it was fun, but I think it was missing the key essence of the novel. Like, it really did not cover a lot of what I thought was most emotionally resonant in that novel.
This is where I'm going to tell you what my favorite adaptation is. What didn't miss the key elements of the novel, and you guys can smack me on the hand, I'm sorry. I'm going to say my favorite adaptations were the Reanimator. You guys know I just did a review of this.
I love Reanimator.
The point about the Reanimator and the Bride of the Reanimator, I watched both of those in the same afternoon, and I had watched them when I was a kid. And I've read Herbert West, The Reanimator. Yeah. And Herbert West, The Reanimator, an H.P. Lovecraft story, sci-fi again, really is a great adaptation because it takes the core components and the understanding of the beast and the monster that's the doctor, and the interrelationships of the assistants and everything, and it really culminates it. And when I watched The Reanimator the other day, there are key points to this film because it's a schlocky, gory, FX, fantastic thing to watch. However, there are points where you're like, there's the humanity in Frankenstein. When Herbert West is like, come on, buddy, it's okay, I'll save you. And he really has no malice, but he's so directed in his need to create life that he doesn't have any other direction. And once they create, in the second film, The Bride of the Reanimator, 1990, they create this woman. It's not like they just decided to do it for the fuck of it. He used the heartstrings of his assistants and the emotion. So the dichotomy we see in Frankenstein is played out in two different characters. The King character and the West character. They take on the dichotomy of the one person. And when you watch like the humanity and the help and the need to survive and provide life and who wants to love, and then you see the hubris and the need to control and the need to make life, And there are some moments where there are speeches by Herbert West that you're like, holy shit, that could be from Shelley.
Yeah, and I think with that, Jeffrey Combs is probably the best portrayal of a mad scientist.
That makes
screen.
sense. I have seen Reanimator, but I have not seen Bride of Reanimator. And my memories of Reanimator are a little strange, but yeah, I did like it a lot.
I just watched it. I just reviewed, like, literally what Nate just said. Go ahead with that, with your idea of Jeffrey Combs.
Yeah. My favorite adaptation is the Hammer series, but Peter Cushing doesn't really portray like a mad scientist. He portrays like...
Before we go there, Nate, do you have anything else to say about the Universal ones?
I have only seen the first two.
Okay, me too. And I actually just watched Bride of Frankenstein the other day for the first time.
Yeah, the last time I saw that was probably a long time ago. I recently rewatched the Universal one in preparation for doing this, and it really does mirror the Peake play, even though it was based off of a different play. I think that even though I haven't read the different play, I get the feeling that it liberally borrowed from the Peake play, probably because it was public domain at the time.
Yeah.
So, if you could cannibalize free word sources and make a buck off of it, why not?
Why not? Right.
But the Peake play is really, really, really evident in the 31 Universal film.
Well, I mean, I watched Bride of Frankenstein for the first time, and in contrast to the first one, I thought the script was a lot more lively, but it was also like it also had elements to me that seemed sort of superfluous and not really, not right in a sense, but I enjoyed it a lot because it was so over the top. The first script was very, to me, it was sort of, I mean, we talked about the Brinsley Peake play and how much that might have influenced the first Universal film, and to me that was a little bit, the Universal first script was a little bit dry, and it didn't quite, capture some of the humorous sort of pantomime aspect of the Peake play, and maybe that was purposeful, and maybe that's a good thing. Definitely the things like the process of the creature's creation, and not so much the creation, but the imbuing of life, seems to have gained a special significance in the Universal movies. There's so much noise, there's so much music, there's so much lightning. It's just so over the top.
It's a movie.
It's amazing.
That's what movies do.
Yeah, and it is like that. And then in Bride of Frankenstein, I think Bride of Frankenstein was like, they saw that the first movie was successful, and they tried to make something that was like 1,000,000 times bigger. I don't know. I didn't look up the budgetary figures, and not being able to see, I don't really know what they splashed up on the screen, because I feel like with the second movie, they must have been really successful, because I feel like they really pulled out a lot of the stops and just made it 100% more over the top and funny. And they just tried to really, even if you compare the sound design from the first and second movie, there's barely any music in the 1931 Frankenstein, whereas 1935 Bride of Frankenstein is noisy movie, full of music, full of sound effects, full of, it just seems like they really pushed it to be more. And I think that in a way... It
was the Great Depression, dude. It was like right in the... they needed to make things like that so that people wouldn't be depressed. They had to go see something otherworldly that was bigger and over the top because everyone was starving.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, the trends in horror at the time, specifically for that reason, is you had Universal doing the big budget stuff, but at the same time, you also had the success later on in the early 1940s of people like Val Lewton, who did films like Cat People on a shoestring budget and left kind of more of the horror to the imagination. where the Universal Frankenstein films, you really see the introduction of the huge electrical equipment. I mean, they're dealing with these like enormous coils and stuff like that, creating these enormous sparks, and it's loud and it's bright, and
but
it's
that's also why it's cheesy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it has to be over the top so it can like really reach a different audience and try to take everybody out of the toils of life and then bring them out. And then when you look context and culturally wise, when you look at that difference in the Hammer films, there is a completely different, the Hammer films, there's a completely different socio-cultural complex going on at the time. And that's why they were so lurid.
So let's talk a bit about the Hammer films. I have watched all these films. I think Nate has watched 4 of them. The Hammer Frankenstein series was played from 1957 till sometime in the early 70s. I can't remember what year, but in 1957, Hammer, which is a British film studio responsible for a lot of movies that I really like, created this film called The Curse of Frankenstein. In this film, they depict Frankenstein as this royal figure who has a lot of resources and money at disposal because he is well-born, presumably. He has a superior interest in science, which he basically uses to further his personal aims along with his resources. And he is the ultimate in very charismatic, but extremely unethical and extremely, basically a person that does not really care about anything except the ends justifying the means that he does, which is, it gets pretty extreme. For example, the first movie, which is the closest to following Shelley's book, and even then, it doesn't follow it that closely. But in that story, he decides, and this is actually something that we just sort of talked about a little bit earlier when we were talking about the book, but the brain for the creature, he decides it needs to be a superior brain, so it needs to be the brain of someone he respects as a scientist and as somebody who is smart. So he actually kills that person and uses that brain. In the end, it comes to nothing because the brain gets damaged. And so the whole essence of the Hammer Frankenstein series is that the monster is not that important. Frankenstein himself is what's important. Frankenstein, as portrayed by Peter Cushing, we won't include the Ralph Bates version, which was a sort of strange diversion that they had. But the Peter Cushing Frankenstein is basically a very driven man who will do anything to further his ideas of science. So even though I actually disagree with the idea that the hubris of scientific advancement is as important in the Frankenstein book as a responsibility, the fact that Hammer took that essence of the scientist who goes too far and took it to its logical extreme is something that I actually like, and that it is an adaptation that works for me precisely because of the fact that it's so different. And Nate was saying earlier that he allows a lot of leeway with adaptations, and to me, Hammer really, they took an aspect of the Frankenstein character and they exaggerated it to the point of extremity. And if you watch all the movies in a sort of sequence, you could actually see how he becomes more and more driven and more unethical as the movies progress.
What's really funny? I don't like those movies because they fucking exemplify that. And they don't talk about the monster. And the monster is my favorite part.
Yeah, the monster is almost secondary in pretty much the entire franchise. I mean, I've only seen the first 4, and I think the monster's only in 1 and 3 out of those. 2 and 4, if I recall, are different. It's been a while since I've seen those.
Well, they all have a monster in them,
right?
In some capacity.
Doesn't exemplify what the monster should be. And that's why other depictions of the monster in media have been so wonderful to see now, because he's thoughtful, he's an outcast, he's different. He's fire on the outside, but wonderful and love on the inside. And his actions are nothing but love. And when you talk about the difference between the monster and Frankenstein and what Shelley was trying to do and how it's translated media-wise, I'm going to root for the monster every time. And Hammer Films
Me too,
really
but
lost the mic drop. Like, Hammer Films really looked at the wrong character to exemplify.
Yeah, they were definitely looking at Frankenstein, the scientist, not the not the creature.
I think there's room. I think there's room enough in the world for both.
No, absolutely. But the
let's hear
portrayals
another opinion. Nate, what do you think about that?
Yeah, as you were saying, I think Reanimator, specifically Combs' portrayal, is a good contrast to Cushing, because Cushing portrays Frankenstein as this like ice cold killer who, while he's doing these extreme immoral things, he has the air and the confidence that knows what he's doing is 100% correct. Whereas Combs and some of the other portrayals as Frankenstein,
he's really nervous and kind of like
exactly. They're very shaky. They're very like insecure.
Which is closer to Shelley's novel.
Yeah, but the portrayal of Frankenstein as more of a sadistic killer rather than kind of an incompetent, not necessarily incompetent, but nervous.
He was struggling with his own morality.
Right. And he didn't know what to do when he made the discoveries that he made. He didn't know what to do when he unleashed them on the world. He was just very unsure of what to do about the entire situation, where Peter Cushing is always in control, even when he's like...
May I say, like our God?
And then
like
the
our
fifth,
God. Like,
the fifth movie.
Let's take it to our God. I mean, we can take it to our God. Like, toying with the idea of life. And then life happens and he doesn't know what to do with it, so he abandons it.
Yeah.
And I think that when we look at books like this and films like this, we look at the concept of man as God. That's why it was called the modern Prometheus, because it was man trying to attain God-like power, and he was struggling to attain that. But then when he does, what does he do? Nothing. He can't. So God himself can't even attain his own power, because once he's created life, he's already abandoned it because it's too big for him to deal with. And when we look at these characters and the complexity in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the complexity in Mary Shelley's Lionel, or the complexity in the way she portrays plague and pestilence, we're really looking at a God complex. And also the abandonment issue, and Nate brought it up. This is what she was dealing with from day one, and we as humans deal with.
And none of the adaptations really do.
The abandonment.
So I guess the message here is, HBO, if you're listening, I'd be willing to take a 7-figure salary to serve as creative consultant for your adaptation of Frankenstein.
Right?
Yeah, and the thing about the Hammer Frankensteins, I think, is that they reach a point in the fifth movie where it gets so I mean, what Nate said is pretty much true, but I think that there are certain instances, like the end of the first Frankenstein film that Hammer did, where he does really not have control. By the fifth movie, he really is sadistic and nasty. And then in the last one, Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, they really dial it back. And they actually, there's some interesting scenes in that. And there's a scene where he actually, at the end of the movie, leaves with his new assistant. And they have a laugh. And to me, that's actually one of the most cathartic things about it. seeing Peter Cushing crack a smile and laugh, and they're actually able to feel good about something. It's interesting because they've gone through so much, and there's been blackmail and all kinds of nastiness and everything. And at the end of the last movie, they kind of walk off into the sunset together, Cushing and his new assistant, who have been in this mental institution, basically taking advantage of the chaos and all the patients there. And and they have a belly laugh together, and that's like pretty much the last scene. And there's not a lot of humor in Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley is pretty dour sometimes. It's not a bad thing. It's just what it is. Other adaptations really brought certain aspects of this to the fore. They brought the humor to the fore that you wouldn't see.
Could we wrap it up with us giving our 3 top adaptations? What would we tell readers to watch if they were interested in finding out about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? So Nate, what do you think your top 3 adaptations would be?
So I would say probably the first Universal, the first Hammer, and I don't know. I would say read the play over any of their film adaptations. I mean, I love Dark Shadows, but I can't in good conscience recommend watch 600 episodes of a show to somebody. So take that one with a grain of salt. If you like,
what about Young Frankenstein?
Yeah, Young Frankenstein.
You can say that if you want.
I love that movie.
Yeah. Okay. I guess film. We'll put Young Frankenstein at number 3.
Okay, so Young Frankenstein, you guys, you should all watch the first Hammer and the first Universal Frankenstein. John, what do you think are your top 3 adaptations?
The Hammer films are very close to my heart, so I think that in general, I have to say the entire Hammer series, the entire Hammer Frankenstein series.
That's more than 3 films, dude. 3 films.
Okay. Then I'm going to say Curse of Frankenstein, Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, and Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell.
Gotcha. Oh,
talk about those lurid titles.
Right? If I was going to give one, I would say my favorite adaptation, Okay, I'm going to go with what I said before. I think that looking at Frankenstein like a person, watch the Penny Dreadful Frankenstein episodes. They're so from the novel. I'm going to also say The Reanimator and The Bride of the Reanimator. And if I was going to give another one, The Curse of Frankenstein is badassable. It's very good. So that's what we have to say about Mary Shelley this week. As we close, Nate, do you have anything to end with? Do you have any shout-outs or places we can find you?
You can find me in the next episode.
Gotcha. And John, do you have any places we can find you on social media or shout-outs that you would like to share?
So, so now that we've finished this discussion, I just wanted to basically give some small shout-outs and wrap things up. Okay, so first off, I would like to mention that we have had a few listeners so far. I would like to send a shout-out to Jennifer, who gave us a lot of feedback, and I know was looking forward to the Mary Shelley episode. Also, Raven, also Camille, also the people from the Watchers in the Fourth Dimension podcast, which I think I mentioned a little bit in our episode 0 as one of the things that sort of got me interested in the idea of doing podcasts just by hearing how they were doing things. Watchers actually gave us a plug. They mentioned us on their page, and that's really cool. They are a Doctor Who podcast. They actually have been watching the original show so far from the beginning. So they started in 1963. They are working on actually covering the entire series. So they actually made it to the Patrick Troughton era. And it's 4 guys from Georgia USA, and they really know what they're doing, and they're really cool. So the URL is watchersforD.podbean.com. And if you were a Doctor Who fan, you should definitely check that out. And that's pretty much all I have for the shoutouts for now. Well, I have my Facebook, but also the Goodreads account, which is Damnable Reverend. And that's where I actually do talk about books that I read, although I haven't really added much to it lately. But I definitely intend to say something about The Last Man at Frankenstein, since we've had so much to say about those today. And yeah.
Okay, so you can find me at Facebook on the Offbeat. It's a Offbeat movie group. You can find that Offbeat Cult, Grindhouse, and Sci-Fi. Next time, tune in to episode 3, The Mummy from Star Psi. We're going to be reading Star Psi of Cassiopeia by De Fontenay and The Mummy by Jane Webb. Good night and good luck.